On this week's NFV SDN Reality Check, we look at some of the top news items from across the space, as well as speak with Open Networking Foundation about telecom benefits from its updated Atrium SDN platform. Well, thanks for joining us for this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. I'm your host, Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief at RCR Wireless News. On today's show, we have an interview with Dan Pitt, who's the Executive Director of the Open Networking Foundation, on the telecom benefits of its recently updated Atrium SDN platform. But first, let's take a look at some of the top headlines from across the telecom-related NFV, SDN, cloud, and software space from the past week. Well, Cisco this week announced a partnership with Verizon Enterprise Solutions to offer its Cisco Spark cloud-based collaboration service to Verizon customers as part of the telecom giant's expansion of next-generation collaboration solutions. The agreement is said to provide Spark Message and Spark Meet features integrated with Verizon's business collaboration services, tapping unified communications and collaboration as a service models and Verizon's contact center services. The service, which is set to be available later this year, is set to run over Verizon's wireless and global wireline networks. Cisco added the platform will be hosted on its cloud infrastructure and built using an open system designed to allow developers to build applications on top of the service. The move comes as Verizon is reportedly shutting down its public cloud operations in favor of its private cloud services. According to a report earlier this month from Fortune magazine, customers using Verizon Public Cloud Reserved Performance and Marketplace will see those services shutter on April 12th. Those said to be impacted have reportedly been asked to migrate their content to Verizon's virtual private cloud platform. Reports earlier this year claimed Verizon was looking to raise more than $2.5 billion through the sale of its 48 data centers as it continued to monetize non-core assets. The assets include those acquired as part of its $1.4 billion purchase of Telemark worldwide in 2011, which it said at the time would bolster its cloud service operations. Verizon CFO Fran Chamoux at an investor conference this week said the carrier did indeed have some very prime properties in the data center portfolio, but that it was still in the early stages of exploring its options. Also this week, telecom operators showed increasing support for the Open Compute Project, speaking on behalf of the organization at this week's Open Compute Project Summit. Representatives from Deutsche Telekom, SK Telecom, AT&T, and Verizon spoke on a panel at the event about the role collaborative research and development plays in the fiercely competitive service provider landscape. Ken Doyle, who's the AVP of New Technology Product Development and Engineering at AT&T, said collaborative research was a matter of survival and that its customers are demanding services that can only be achieved through collaboration. Verizon's SVP and CIO, Mahmoud Al-Assour, touched on the ability of open source to create true network personalization for customers, and the historic focus was on speed and supporting various protocols on the same network. Al-Assour also said it was important to extend the reach of telecom computing and software as far out to the edge of the network as possible. Well, for this week's featured interview, we spoke with Dan Pitt, who's the Executive Director of the Open Networking Foundation, to get some insight into the organization's recently launched Atrium SDN platform and benefits for the telecom space. Pitt also touched on how he views the continued evolution and adoption of SDN and software-based solutions by mobile carriers and potential challenges still facing the space. Let's take a look at the interview now. I'm Dan Meyer, Editor-in-Chief here at RCR Wireless News. This week we're joined by Dan Pitt, who's the Executive Director of the Open Networking Foundation, to talk a bit about some news from the organization. But so Dan, thanks for joining us this week. We appreciate it.
You're welcome, Dan. It's good to talk to you again.
Very good, very good. Well, maybe start off with, for those who don't know much about ONF, maybe a quick overview of the organization, kind of what you guys do.
Sure. The Open Networking Foundation is a 5-year-old nonprofit industry trade association that was created to make a commercial success out of open software-defined networking, Open SDN. And we were really started by the inventors of OpenFlow and SDN to make it industrial strength and commercially successful. Our portfolio started out with just the OpenFlow standard, the protocol standard. But that was just really temporary because we've always viewed standards as only one tool in our toolbox. And we all of us had a lifetime of interesting experiences in standards organizations, and we did not want to. We wanted to learn from all of those experiences, put it that way. And consequently, our goal isn't to make standards. Our goal is to see this stuff commercially adopted. So we have quite a broad portfolio, but all aimed at the successful commercial adoption for network operators of all types of SDN. Now, when I use operators as a term, It means telecom service providers, major enterprises, internet companies, data center operators, and even small and medium businesses. Somebody who operates a network but has a business purpose for doing so, as opposed to vendors who want to sell into those things. So they are really our customers, and we keep them, foremost in our mind. So our thrusts for the last few years have really been threefold: Open SDN, Open Flow, and open source. So with Open SDN, these are the interface definitions, the architecture definitions, the models, and the things that essentially give people an understanding of how this is constructed, and better yet, how to use it, how to interface to it, how to put SDN to the service of applications and business processes. Mm-hmm. We've been doing that from the beginning. Open Flow, of course, is the southbound protocol from the control plane to the forwarding plane. It's really three things. It's an architecture, a model, and a protocol, where the architecture is the separation of forwarding and control. The model is match action, look at an incoming signal, look for a match, look up in a table the action, execute the action. The forwarding plane doesn't need to know why those actions are taken. It's told those by the control plane. Mm-hmm. And the third part, of course, is the protocol itself in its current incarnation. And this is all evolving to meet the needs of a wider and wider spectrum of users, starting with the big internet companies, data center companies, and now going to telecoms and companies with enterprises with branch offices through the software-defined WAN, and wireless operators and optical networking specialists. The third pillar, of course, is open source software, mm-hmm. and actually open source hardware through OCP, which is just a vehicle for getting this into people's hands faster. It's also a significant and important manifestation of the fundamental change in networking as it's becoming more of a computing discipline. Mm-hmm. Used to be networking was all hardware boxes. Well, now much of networking, there still is transmission, but much of networking takes place in ordinary servers, in data centers, where the control, the application, the governance, the use of the network for some business purpose is instantiated. Mm-hmm. And so software is the way that's done. Software standards are usually determined by the market, because especially in the case of open source, if you don't like it, you can change it. And it takes 15 minutes, and you iterate on it until you like it. And when people know about it, and it's good enough for people to deploy, you have an instant standard. But in the meantime, you get feedback, and you learn what works, what doesn't work. And you don't need a committee in a smoke-filled room to hammer out what the software interface should look like, and then you go and deploy it. It happens in the reverse. So we are trying to help lead the networking industry into the world of software and computing. And in fact, we are fortunate that we are taking advantage of the advances in computing that have moved so fast in the last 15 or 20 years, and networking is just catching up to those. Everything from distributed computing to virtualization to multi-core processors and multi-threaded applications. They've already gotten the arrows in their back for that, and we're the ones just kind of riding the coattails. So it's an exciting time. We're mindful of our real obligation to the industry, yeah, to help the industry move along and get through as disruptive a technology as this one in as positive a way as possible. And that includes the operators, and it includes the vendors too.
Makes sense. Well, obviously, you touched a bit on the standard side there, and maybe we'll get back to it a little bit later, because I know, at least in telecom space, standards is a very contentious issue, as it is across most spaces as well. But maybe we'll get back to that part a little bit later. But I know one thing I want to talk to you guys about initially was you came out very recently with an update to your Atrium platform, and that was adding open daylight support to it. Can you, I guess, just give a little overview of what that was, and I guess maybe the importance of bringing that support of open daylight into the platform now.
Sure. So Atrium is something we released first last June, yep, and it's just a packaging of a useful vertical slice of open source components. We are a small organization in terms of staff. We're like 3 full-time people, and we have more than 100 member companies, and they have like thousands of employees. But we're not a big open source, project. We're not in the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, or OpenStack, anything like that. looking for the truck. So what we did is we took some major components that were sort of standalone, and we integrated them and packaged them so you can just download it and run stuff. How do you just get open source versions of SDN? You'd have to be your own system integrator up until we did this last summer. So we put together something that would be a useful place to start. It was BGP peering as the application running on the ONOS open source controller, talking OpenFlow 1.3 to hardware switches, of which last June there were 7 that we demonstrated, 2 white box switches based on the Open Compute Project OCP that we built, and then 5 of our members who are vendors make very, very different types of switches for different markets. They also interface to it as well. We package that up. We put in some features that really give you interoperability among different switches and portability of applications. And that's important. So we put that out there. People are playing with it, and we did it on ONOS. We had experience with that. We put in this flow objectives interface so the application doesn't know the details of the switch. And we've got some trials, market feedback, but we said at the time, last June, the next release would incorporate Open Daylight. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One reason is that it gets us into a larger sphere of the user community. And we really want to serve as many users and customers out there as we can. So Open Daylight has a big community following, and we wanted to reach them and give them this tool also. It also gives us the opportunity to take essentially an application and make it controller independent. So you can now see, you can take an application and you can run it on ONOS in this environment, run it Open Daylight here, maybe run it on Reuse some other place and fashion, to really help build an ecosystem of interchangeable components so that network operators can build best-of-breed networks using a combination of open source and proprietary software and hardware. And we're fans of open source for those components that don't require vendor differentiation. Let the industry come together, collaborate. Everybody puts in a little and takes out a lot. They concentrate the rest of their expensive resources on custom solutions that make their company unique and help their customers rather, apply them in unique ways to their businesses. So there's always a balance here of the best way to serve the market, and we let the market make those decisions. We just try to enable choice.
Makes sense. So what was involved in, I guess, with bringing Open Daylight on this? Because obviously, like you said, you guys started initially with ONOS as kind of the platform for this, bringing Open Daylight. I guess, was there any, not to get too technical on it, but I guess, behind the scenes, what was it like to bring that support onto the platform now? Sure.
And this was done primarily by a couple of our members that happened to be in Bangalore, Criterion Networks and WePro Technologies. You know that.
Yep.
And so the first thing was Quagga for BGP. There's a tremendously large community supporting Open Daylight, but there hadn't really been an open source BGP implementation because most of the vendors there have their own and they didn't really need one. But there's a strong demand for this sort of thing. So we ported Quagga into Open Daylight. We then did the flow objectives interface. This really allows the application not to know the details of how the switches are implemented, but to say these are the objectives I have for the flow in an abstract fashion. And SDN is all about abstracting the network and its behavior. So the applications don't need to know the details like they have for the last 30 years. So the porting of flow objectives was quite important, and we had to use some of the internal constructs of the DIDM in Open Daylight, make it run, and then get some compatible switches that already do hardware OpenFlow 1.3 through the OpenFlow version in Open Daylight under the SAL, and actually to make it work. So there was a fair amount of engineering, definitely some new code and some new features, but we work in harmony with that community, so that becomes part of what other people can get whenever they want to download the files for Open Daylight.
Yeah, got it. I was asking, I guess, how was that working with Open Daylight on this? Because I've talked to them in the past, and again, they have a very similar mantra to you guys. They're trying to, obviously help the community as much as they can, get their platform out there as wide as they can. I'm guessing, I would think that working with them, it was a fairly easy process.
Yeah, there was no difficulty at all. Now, the question is, who is them? So you contribute code, and you have to go through code reviews.
Yeah.
And, they have the committers, they have the technical steering committee, they have all of that stuff. And that's to assure that whatever goes in there is good code, and meets quality standard. the organization of the Open Daylight project itself doesn't really get involved in that sort of thing, but we have had every degree of cooperation we could have wanted from them. And that includes, let's come to agreement on how it's going to be distributed and how licensing is going to work and things like that. So they've been excellent partners as well.
Got it. Yeah, I always figure the coders, the guys behind the scenes, they always tend to get along pretty well for the most part because they know what they're going after. It always seems to me like the people in charge who tend to kind of maybe have some butting of heads. Not to say you guys had any butting of heads, but that always seems to be maybe more of the challenge is getting everybody on the same page when it comes to what your plans are and kind of how you're going with these deployments. So.
Well, there is that, but I would point out that it's the code jockeys who butt heads a lot, but purely on the basis of code quality.
Got it.
In general, the open source software world is just hyper-focused on quality code. And sometimes this brings out, some, nasty behavior and some personal things that go on, which I don't think need to be there necessarily. But it's all in the worshiping of quality code to make a good open source product.
Yeah, I guess if the underlying, end goal for everybody is the same as to have a quality out there, I guess that's, you're going to have a little bit of, challenges there. But as long as everybody's working towards the same goal on that makes the most sense.
And that's how it's been for us.
Yeah, very good, very good. Well, I guess now, going back to the Atrium launch back last year, and obviously the new one is just coming out just now. But I guess how has the reception been to Atrium from the community out there at large, and maybe even looking at kind of the telecom space more specifically? What's the reception been so far to Atrium? So
it's been good. We've had some interesting trials of with some telecom service providers, with some big research networks. We've gone transoceanic from Australia to North America, and this release of Atrium has really three features, and one is the porting to Open Daylight, which we have spoken about, and the others have to do really with the ONOS side. That we continue to improve the ONOS version to incorporate some IGP. So if you want to use ISIS or OSPF, that's in there as well. And just some improvements in strengthening and performance. But also we added something called the leaf spine fabric for this version, which really allows you to build kind of a network. The initial, Atrium router is a controller, doing BGP and the controller, and then a switch. And from the outside, it looks like a BGP peering router, but it's built on a controller and an OpenFlow switch. With a leaf spine fabric, it's a controller and a network of OpenFlow switches, which is how you think of SDN, as one control plane and multiple instances of the forwarding plane. And that's going into this thing called CORD, coming out of the ON lab, the central office re-architected as a data center.
Yes. Well done.
It's better as an acronym. And that's going into some major trials, sometime this year that you'll hear about when they're prepared to talk about it.
Yeah.
So what we're really providing is some things for people to experiment with and to learn from. We don't sell a packaged product, and will this get incorporated in various ways into supported products? At some point, it will. We have a very good working relationship with the so-called NREN community, the National Research and Education Network community. The chair of our Research Associates group in Dermonga is a CTO for the Energy Sciences Network, ESNet here. So he was very instrumental in the work we did in Australia with ARNet and CSIRO, and with Internet 2. And so they really eat this stuff up, and they're kind of the proving ground. So it's been really good to work with them as well.
Makes sense. I guess, how have you viewed the pace of all this development and deployment as well? I mean, it seems like, from my point of view, I've been covering this nearly as long as you guys have been around, but over the past couple of years, it seems like that the pace, at least in the telecom side of things, there's been a lot of pull from telecom operators and wanting, SDN and virtualization into their networks. Obviously, the vendor community has been maybe a little bit slower catching up to it, but it seems like that the pace of development of all this has kind of been fairly aggressive. I mean, it's been moving along, it seems, at a pretty good clip. I mean, what's been your general view of how this has all kind of been evolving at this point?
Well, it's evolving very rapidly among the leading edge, really experimenters, but not across the board. And that includes major enterprises as well. They're learning about it. They're trying to understand how it affects their supply chain. How it affects their business processes, and how it affects their staff and their skills. And all those are taking time. How do you deliver this kind of stuff? What kind of products do you do you actually get that are supported? How much software skill do you want in-house? And the telecom service providers, they haven't had that much, and they're trying to figure out how much do I need to have, how much can I rely on my current vendors, how much on system integrators, where do I get this, and what do I really focus my expertise on? So this is all being worked out. We certainly hear about the leading ones that are really pushing the envelope, whether it's AT&T or Deutsche Telekom, NTT, China Mobile, Telefonica, Telstra through PACnet and PCCW Global out of Hong Kong. And people are looking at them to see what their experiences are, and they're sharing those experiences. The major enterprises are being led by the financial services industry, and they're adopting SDN and OCP for the open source hardware, not so much NFV like the carriers are. And they're kind of the bellwether for the other major enterprises. And we talked to them. I got a call recently from a major airline that's been looking at this for a while and is ready to dig in a little bit deeper. One of the challenges that everyone talks about is the culture change in these operators about getting into software and about their staffs and the skills. So we launched this year our skills certification program for SDN, just 2 levels, an associate level and an engineer level. And we had our first international cohort take a 3-day class that somebody offered, and then we sanctioned the exam in Bangalore 2 weeks ago. And we had a class of 15 that are now certified SDN associates. Yeah. This is a process that's going to take some time. AT&T is offering their AT&T University to 100,000 or so engineers to help them learn about the software that they're interested in. The company is going to need more skills in. So I would say that there's been a rapid embrace of things that are easy to do first, which is the right way to do it, such as NFV, where you're just consolidating into a server what you had in an appliance that really was just doing computing. The next phase is to put everything in a data center, use cloud technologies, and then run the network remotely using the flexible kind of technology that's behavior is determined by external software. And that's where SDN comes in to connect those two. So this is a process that's going to take quite some time. And we're happy to help the industry experiment in as painless a way as possible. We have a migration working group that's really been helping to map out how do you procure stuff, how do you try things without ending up at a dead end or a blind alley, so that the investment you make is not throwaway investment. So this is why it's important for us to work with the user community around the world.
Yeah, that skill set that you bring up, and that's something I've talked to a lot of operators about, and that's been their biggest challenge. They've even said, vocally is, hey, we have to make sure our employees are up to speed on this, and bringing them along is a huge challenge. And like you said, that thing you guys, your own work you've been doing on the engineering and certification part of it, I saw it come out late last year, and like you said,
right,
it didn't happen. But that was it seemed to me as a huge step forward to make sure that obviously the telecom guys are doing it themselves, but to have like a broader community supporting that increased skill set level. Is a big part of this. That's going to help bring everything along much quicker in a more efficient manner. So that's a big part of making sure everybody's on board with that too. So a big part of it there. Well, maybe one final topic and question before I let you go, and maybe going back a bit to the standards issue is, I guess as you look forward on this, what are some of the challenges you see perhaps in the way of further development and deployment of SDN out there, at least in the telecom world as well? Because again, the standards part of it, I've talked to a lot of carriers about this, and they still seem to have a lot of concern about standards because, to them, standards is a warm, nice blanket that they're used to working in. And, but obviously from the data center world and the IT world, it's a little different there, how they deal with standards. Maybe as standards as being maybe one of those hurdles, what's your view on how that can be tackled, or at least, how do you convince operators that perhaps you don't need to have a set in stone standard to move forward with virtualization because, again, the community itself is so agile and working towards a common goal with this.
So it's a bit of a challenge, but I think we've been helped a lot by ETSI NFV, which is let's virtualize this stuff, and they come up with some architectures. They don't really call it necessarily standards, although ETSI is a standards organization, and a lot of that's being implemented in various ways. We're helping with that, and partly the telecom industry has to learn how to invest in standards in an efficient way. You have people whose full-time job is to like go to the ITU or something and do standards. Like, how closely are you tied into the services your company is offering? And for the vendors, how close are you tied into the products that you're building? If you're just a full-time standards person, you have to be connected to make it effective.
Mm-hmm.
And some of these people have had a lifelong history of being successful in making standards, and it's not going to be as necessarily useful as it has been. And so they are starting to change. So I gave a presentation to an ITU meeting in Geneva 2 weeks ago. I did it from Bangalore on standards and open source. What does it mean to the ITU to consider what's happening in the realm of open source? How does it work? And I explained how it works and how it differs from standards and how the governance is completely different. As we talked about, whether something gets adopted is based on the committers who write code and have submitted code. It's not based on a bureaucrat somewhere that takes other things into account. So it's turning into a bit of a new world, and we're just helping to educate them on that. One place where traditional and new standards organizations are working well together is in the area of information modeling of all things. We're helping to promote a common information model and automatic generation of these models, be they Yang or something else, so that operators can compare different products, know exactly what they do. Vendors can build consistent product lines, so you don't have a model for each product, which means it's not a model, it's just a description of that product. It's not really a model for a class of products. And there was a big meeting last month that Cable Labs hosted, and we provided a bunch of sort of technical inputs to in our documents and information modeling. And working collaboratively with MEF on that, and with ETSI, the TM Forum also. And so I think this is an interesting and unexpected area of advancement that kind of helps bridge these two worlds of software and standards.
Very interesting. Yeah, I think for myself covering this, again, coming from the telecom side of things, covering that for the past 15 years, seeing the evolution of how standards is being viewed from the telecom side of things is perhaps the most interesting thing for me to see, because, again, legacy from telecom is standards. They want to have that kind of, that future proofing. But you're right, it is changing so much now with this move towards software and virtualization. That's been very interesting, at least for me, to kind of see how that's been evolving, how operators are adapting to these new models at varying paces, at varying rates of that adaptation to it. And
I think it's actually good for them, because you're still going to need standards in areas of transmission.
Sure.
And if you look at 5G, so much of 5G is about how do we get massive bandwidth, minimal latency, massive capacity as needed. And so you're going to need these new technologies, but then there's the software that governs how they actually behave is different. And if you separate it, you can let that part of technology evolve as fast as possible without being encumbered by a vertically integrated, monolithic sort of mainframe mindset.
Yeah, you're right. Going forward, those two are going to be really connected with each other. I mean, you're right. It's going to be kind of both of those. And again, with the time frame we're looking at for 5G deployments coming out the next 4 or 5 years, it's going to be a pretty rapid evolution of how those all work together. So very interesting. Obviously, ONF is going to be a big part of this, and all these other open source communities are going to be huge parts of this. So it's great to kind of see that kind of work being worked out going forward. And again, your work with the latest one with Atrium, bringing open data on board too, just shows kind of like collaboration going on in the open source community, which is good to see, and seems like that's really going to bolster this movement going forward. So
yeah, we really are a community and an ecosystem. We've tried to build an open SDN ecosystem from day one. And it's really coming along very well. A lot of these other organizations were spawned by the availability of SDN and NFV concepts. Yeah. We still try to work with them to make sure we're all working in harmony and not overlapping or anything, and filling gaps that the customers require to be filled.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, great. Hey, Dan, we definitely appreciate the great insight of this today. It was good to kind of see the news come out with Atrium there, with the update there. And like I said, it's good to always see the open source community working together to kind of further these technologies too. But we definitely appreciate the insight on this today. And hopefully we'll touch base again soon as you guys, again, roll out some new deployments or new developments as well. But definitely appreciate the time today. Thanks so much.
Well, you bet. It's been always a pleasure to talk to you, and really appreciate the interest you have in these leading edge developments that are changing the industry that we both love.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds great. Well, thanks again for the time. Well, thanks for joining us for this week's NFV SDN Reality Check. Make sure to check us out again next week when we are scheduled to speak with a CDN on challenges facing QoS for operators moving towards 5G, NFV, and SDN platforms.
NFV SDN Reality Check with Dan Meyer is a production of RCR TV. To suggest show topics or to reach Dan, you can find him on email, dmeyer@rcrwireless.com. and on Twitter at Meyer_Dan. For more Dan, news on NFV SDN, and everything wireless, find your way over to rcrwireless.com.